Welcome to setting up a basic render network. Real-time rendering is a part of the work that's typically done with TouchDesigner, and it's important for us to understand some of the essential elements that go into these networks. Render networks are made up of operators across multiple families, so let's start by opening up our Create dialog and actually getting started here in the component family. I'm going to hold down the Control key and add a camera, geometry, and light here to my network. I'm going to release the Control key, head over to the top family, and grab a render top here to add into my network. Now, my components here make up the elements that I need for my render top. And if I take a look at my render top, I'll see that I need a camera, geometry, and lights. Now, these are path-based, which means that I can actually specify which one of these operators is being used by the operator's name or network path. So important to notice this asterisk here means all of the geometry components here in this part of my network. And in fact, we can see that kind of play out a little bit better. I'm going to move my light. I'm going to use the tab key to open up the Create dialog. I'm going to head over to the SOP family, and I'm going to add a box SOP here into my network. Next, I'm going to right click on the output of my box SOP. I'm going to head over to components, and I'm going to grab a geometry component and add it to my network. Now we'll notice that I see a link here. So it seems like I ought to be rendering this piece of geometry, but I don't see it in my render top. So let's actually look at how we can arrange our workspace in a way that will give us another vantage point into what's happening. I'm going to head up to the pane layout portion of our interface here, and I'm going to split our view into two different panes. With our workspace split into two different panes here on the right hand side, I'm going to use this drop down to change my viewer type to geometry viewer. Now, my geometry viewer lets me see all the geometry in this portion of my network, and that includes my camera and my lights. In fact, if I pan around here, I'll see that there's my light way behind my camera. And now I can see that, sure enough, there is my other piece of geometry. There is that cube that I added, my box SOP. Now, this is really helpful because it gives me another vantage point from which I can examine my networks and examine my geometry. And it's often very useful for us to be able to see this so that we can understand how our camera and geometry are positioned in relationship to one another. Now, there are a few important flags for us to pay close attention to here before we carry on too much further. And that's here at the bottom of our geometry. We'll notice that we have a render and display flag. Let's start by looking here at our geometry. So our geometry, our render flag, controls whether or not this piece of geometry is going to be rendered, whether or not our render top will actually see it. So for example, if I were to turn off the render flag here for my Geo1, we can see that now I can see that cube, but I don't see that torus anymore. So there's my box, but no torus. Okay, well, if I turn that render flag back on, my torus will show back up. That's great. Well, what does this other flag do over here? My display flag controls whether or not that geometry is displayed over in the geometry viewer. So this can be really helpful for me if I want to be able to kind of see what's happening inside of my scene, but I don't necessarily want to see all of that geometry at the same time. Let's turn that back on. Now, just like our components here, our geometry components have these flags. If we take a peek inside of our Geo1 component, we'll see that our torus, our surface operator, also has these flags. And these will have the same effect. So if I toggle this display flag off or on, that will control whether or not I can see it here in the geometry viewer. If I turn off the render flag and I back up here one layer, we'll see that that also controls whether or not I render that piece of geometry. These flags are really important anytime we set up our render networks. So it's worth making sure that both your display and render flag are on for any piece of geometry that you want to have actually show up inside of your render. Okay, let's actually take a look at one other piece here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my camera, and I think I want to go ahead and just translate us up here slightly. So let's come up just like say 2 units. And then here on my rotate, I'm going to hold down the middle mouse button and I'm just going to pan down here slightly. That's great. So right away now I can actually see that piece of geometry here, that my other box that's shown up. Let's add another light to my scene. So I'm just going to copy and paste this light here. Now by default, the lighting's position is here at -10, but I'm actually going to change my light 2's position to 0 And I'm just going to move it up in Y to say 10 instead. If we were to back out here slightly, we can now see that we have a light up here at the top, and we have another light here back behind the camera. If I take a peek over at my render, I can see how that's changed my render a little bit. Let's head over to the light page and let's change the light color to say maybe like a dark blue. And we can see how that light is now contributing to the final render. There are lots of other elements that we might use here inside of our render networks, but this covers the essential elements that we need to actually have a foundational understanding of so we can set up future networks.